Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
That looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Holiday dinners frequently pose challenges, but as differences in politics, philosophy, and faith have become more extreme, such gatherings can become toxic, even or perhaps especially when the guests are related, family. But a new program called Potluck for Democracy believes with the right approach, the dinner table can become a place of connection, not division, even when the guests hold vastly different views and have never met each other. That's the subject of this week's edition of Challenge 2.0. So we're very pleased to welcome with us today, first of all, Reverend Terry Kylo. Terry, the Executive Director of Past Understanding, been on here many times, and as I mentioned, Past Understanding, I serve on the board, and it's the sponsoring organization for the show. So Terry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.
And with Terry is Hannah Hotchkeppel, and Hannah is Director of Youth Programming, and very much involved in this program we're going to be talking about today. And with us also is Reverend Dr. Kara Markell from Seattle University, and you are with the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement, which I think probably speaks very well to what we're going to be talking about today. So, Kara, thank you so much for joining us as well today. As I was looking, as we were going to be addressing this, I noticed that psychologists, of course, have many descriptions of different addictions. And what I didn't know is they've expanded that list to an addiction being a compulsive and repetitive behavior that can be personally and socially harmful. But one that I had not heard discussed more was the addiction to certainty. Have you ever heard of that addiction before? It seems like we see that in mass media, social media, personal interactions where people can't conceive there's an opinion different than their own. Does that strike a chord at all for any of you?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's interesting because I think when you say the addiction to certainty, I think it speaks to people's desire for feeling grounded, feeling rooted, desire for feeling like things make sense to them. And I think we can all sort of think of many examples about the way that the world doesn't make sense all the time and the people around us don't make sense all the time. And so it doesn't surprise me that that's something that's named.
Kara, does that resonate with your experience too?
Certainly. And I think that it's reinforced culturally, it's reinforced in educational systems and religious systems that there is something to know that can be known fully, and that's the right thing to know. And as Hannah pointed out, that's a comforting posture to say that I know and I'm certain about these sorts of things, and not really realize how that can create divisiveness.
Terry, of course, a stereotype is men have an addiction to certainty when we're driving someplace because we never stop and ask directions. But beyond the driving piece, does that resonate with you too? Does that make sense?
It does. And theologian Douglas John Hall said that certainty is really a mere reflection of a lack of trust. And think of all the changes that have happened in the last 500 years and the accelerating change in the last 50. And a lot of folk are feeling like really, as Hannah said, ungrounded and feeling like they just don't know what's going on in the world. I think we also have other factors that are leading to this sort of search for certainty too, because in Europe, 500 years ago, the truth was only the truth if the emperor and the church said it was. And so truth in use of supportive power. And then we went through the Enlightenment and the Reformation, and we got to this place where each individual can figure out, what the truth is. But if you don't have a common grounding in like what is real evidence, well, then you pretty much end up with nihilism, with nothing that is true. And so folk kind of go from truth to truth to truth, evidence to evidence to evidence, but it's not really evidence at all. It's really just defense, I think, of their identity and the identity they get from their own in-group. And so I've seen friends who talked about that if Biden got elected, there was going to be internment camps for conservatives in Montana. But after Biden was elected, he never brought that up again because it obviously didn't happen. And he moves on from truth to truth to truth to kind of defend his in-group. But he actually doesn't ever want to go back and talk about it. He'll even acknowledge, oh, that didn't happen. But his grand theory is still, he thinks, valid. And that's in response to his insecurity about all the changes that are taking place.
And there's the flip side or extension of that. I was just driving, listening to a podcast, and there was a social psychologist named Daryl Van Torgeren who called such behavior an arms race to arrogance. And like the term arms race between nations tends to build a more solid and ever higher wall between nations, does this tend to be behavior that builds an ever more solid separating barrier between people and their ability to discourse?
I have to think of it as a chasm rather than a physical barrier.
Okay.
And the reason being is that I think that often it's not that we can't still see each other. Right? We're still right here across the table, across the street, across the town. But yet the way in which we understand each other continues to separate and separate and separate. It's like this sort of chasm that's getting bigger and bigger, and we don't know how to get across it. Right?
Yeah, and I think that inherent in that also is the potential for kind of a destructive kind of competition. To say that we're right, you're wrong, and then that breeds all kinds of ill will and feelings and behaviors that can manifest in all kinds of ways. There can certainly be people on both sides of the chasm, as you describe it, that are desiring to cross that chasm and don't know how, and there are just as many people who don't have any interest in crossing that chasm and engendering more competition and more divisive policies or language or whatever, however that might manifest in the public discourse.
I really think that a lot of this certainty around truth is really just signaling to your group, whatever you identify with, it's part of your core identity, that you're in with them and that you're against the other group. And so I think that kind of arms race of certainty really isn't about truth at all. I think it's really about in-group versus out-group, us versus them. And how do we get to that kind of identity? Well, it really a lot of times comes from gut associations that we've received over time, often that are based on a lot of racist history or history against historical views that are against other traditions. And then we have an in-group, and then we continue to get more and more polarized. But the other piece is that there's probably 60 or 70% of the population that don't want to be walking on this path and don't want to be on either side of this chasm. And so the question is, how can we help each other who don't want to be polarized that way to begin to engage each other again?
Do you think the differences in politics that we see expressed are driving this, or do you think it goes deeper than that?
There is sort of an innate human capacity to identify difference, right? That is part of how we create safe spaces and create communities of belonging, to say, well, we're different than that. What I think happens and gets amplified in the public discourse is demonizing of the other instead of just recognizing that there is something that's other, demonizing, dehumanizing, and amplifying our own group as the right one, the best one. That's just a natural human tendency. So I'm sure there are people who are very skilled at tapping into that, who are participating in our partisan conversations in this country.
There's the view that basically this is going to be solved from the top down. Politics has to heal politics, faith has to heal faith. Before we can address this, you each have deep background in dealing with these sorts of situations. Do you agree with that, or do you feel that the solution is from the bottom up?
I think the question gets at something really important, Jeff, and a lot of the 70% are like waiting around for politics to fix itself. And they're like watching their TV or listening to their podcasts kind of in horror, kind of concerned about democracy. 75% of Americans are worried about the democracy. And yet we're kind of trained and conditioned to just sit by passively and wait for something to happen. And so I don't think politics can fix politics, and I don't think social media can fix social media. I think we have to have a broad-based movement at every level. And part of what the Potluck is getting at is to help people recognize what they can do in their local area. what is within their power to engage in that can contribute to a more healthy, functioning democracy and a more peaceful society.
I think it was Margaret Mead that said, never underestimate the power of a small group of people. I think that's really true, and I think the scope for me to say, I'm going to fix the church, feels impossible. And then I get sort of frozen. I don't know what to do. But I can gather some people around a table and have a conversation. And we can't underestimate the power of those conversations, that dialogue, revealing more truth and creating more connection. With the potluck is that you gather people around a table, and then those people go out and gather people around their table, and that it has this kind of exponential potential to create pathways to change, pathways to relationship.
So we've talked about it by title, Potluck for Democracy. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of that. How did the idea get developed? And then just explain what the concept is.
Well, during the pandemic, I just engaged in lots of conversation with literally atheists to Zoroastrians about, what do we do in a society that seems to be polarized and kind of coming apart? And then one day in January was listening to a podcast about this, this group of people who believe that on left and the right, that believe that political violence is necessary, and what do we do? And so I called up Michael Trice from Seattle University, and we've been partners for a while, and deepening that partnership. And we talked about creating a toolkit, talked about the need, and also talked about the power of local communities to get people together and start this exponentially increasing movement for us to come together and respect each other. And so we ended up calling it Potluck for Democracy and working on the toolkit together. And we're trying to promote this across the country.
Hannah, where did you come into this? And then Kara, I'd ask the same question. Obviously, you had that initial conversation with Seattle U, but how has it developed and spread from this point?
I was really intrigued by the idea of it, and also really grateful to have some partners in thinking about how do we make it easier? So what is it like to really create a tool that lets people gather and helps them feel like they can gather even without somebody who is convening them?
Yeah. Kara, from your perspective at Seattle U and working in interreligious dialogue, how did this strike you as being something that could really cut across some of these barriers and create connections instead of division?
Yeah. Our work at the center is to curate opportunities for people, possibilities for engagement, right, of encounter. Those opportunities to be in the room with others in a posture of openness and curiosity has the potential to transform everybody around the table. That's part of the core work of what we do at the center. And so being in relationship with lots of organizations, Paths to Understanding being one of those, is to connect with all of our constituencies around the Puget Sound region to share these kinds of resources, to share our platform. I know how hard it can feel to gather people even from another Christian church sometimes, or other people that sort of seem very much like us. And then what the more difficult thing of reaching out across is significant. I think it has a real capacity to transform how communities that feel isolated from one another, but are desiring to cross the chasm can come together around this toolkit and have a really positive experience on all sides. Yeah.
Now, you've had one. Terry, can you tell us a little bit about what your experience was? Not only, and what was the reaction of the people that were participating both to the potluck, but also to each other as they encountered people that were from groups that maybe they didn't ordinarily encounter?
Well, what was interesting is we tried to gather leaders for this first one. So we went to Louisville, Kentucky. We were there for some other reasons, and I called up a friend of mine, and he began to gather people. And there was a lot of conversations that got going. And then we had it at this really cool little church, which is an art gallery as well. And we had people from pretty conservative theological points of view, Muslims, LGBTQ, some more moderate to progressive, Christian leaders as well. And it was fascinating just to watch people sit and be human with each other. It wasn't any big theological debates so much. And Hannah was there as well, and she was actually facilitating the group that day.
Well, it's interesting. You think, oh, we gathered a bunch of leaders. They know how to talk to each other already. It's not true. we're all when we sit down at a table just to be ourselves, outside of the context of our role or our, we're all just human beings, right? And it's just as challenging often to talk to people we've never met before. And I think that was the interesting thing, to see people sort of like stumble their way into conversation, right? Because it's awkward when you don't know someone. And so there was just this tremendous growth sort of across this, 90 minutes, 2 hours that people were sitting there together. One of the gifts I think that this particular toolkit and this potluck gives is a space, a safe space, as you've talked about before, for people to realize that they can show up differently and nothing's going to break around them, right? Nothing about their identity goes away if they show up in a conversation differently than they're used to showing up.
Right.
And they still get to talk about themselves, and they still get to bring their whole selves, but they also get to learn something new.
We have some video of that potluck experience, and we're going to put that on air right now so that all of you watching get an opportunity to understand exactly what happened. Obviously, it's just a small sample, but let's go to that for a moment. If somebody is watching this or hears about it, becomes interested in sponsoring or at least becoming involved in this, what would you tell them?
Well, first of all, let's remember what our power is. Let's imagine for a minute that in this really divided time where 30% of people are just like, really anxious and fractured, and where 70% want something to do. If a quilting club, if a Kiwanis or Seroptimist or Rotary, or some other community group, or an atheist agnostic book reading club, or a church or a mosque or a temple actually extended invitations out to their community and brought people together. Because what we're being tempted with right now is the idea that if we're different, we can't get along. But if people of deeply held conviction come together, actually have a good time, and do what we know how to do, which is a potluck with forks and spoons and knives and plates, and serving the food on both sides so we all get our food on time, right? We know how to do that. Imagine the stories that will ripple out from that. And so imagine the power of people in their neighborhood taking a deep breath and saying, wow, these folk are different from each other, but they actually enjoyed being together. And imagine what would happen if that began to happen in every neighborhood. Because think strategically. We can't fix Facebook and politics with one fell swoop, but we have churches, mosques, and temples, and different organizations and nonprofits, and quilting groups and golf club buddies in every neighborhood in the country.
Right.
And so we have more power collectively than we think we do, and it's not that hard, and it's kind of fun.
I might ask, Kara and Hannah, you work with young people, university setting, and you have a wide approach to that. We're talking about leadership in community, typically older people, maybe not as much gray hair as I have, but what about younger people? Do they need this just as much, and could this also be used to engage them and cross some boundaries as well? Kara, I might begin with you at the university setting.
There are certainly lots of initiatives on any college campus really, that are promoting leadership among students. And so this, because the toolkit isn't written with any particular perspective, it's not, you don't even have to be a religious organization to do one of these. There's tremendous potential for two different clubs to get together and share a meal. As a parent of teens, they begrudgingly get dragged to many things that
we all have experience with that.
Perhaps don't see the value of right away, but as an educator, as a ordained minister, whatever capacity that is, I think getting my children, getting other kids into these places where they can engage difference in a fun way, in a relaxed way, just talking, not arguing their case for anything in particular, just get to know people, I think it makes them essentially better neighbors, makes them better friends at school, better advocates in the world for the kind of change that they want to see, however that manifests, whether it's politics or church or any sphere, really.
Hannah, what about your experience? And we know the kids, I look back at my experience when I was in school. You didn't have social media. You didn't have some of the things that you could have a bad day either at practice or in school, and you'd leave it behind. You'd get home and you'd maybe ruminate on that, but you'd leave it behind. And now it's with you 24/7. And that seems that there's a lot of in-group, out-group too. How could this be used to help eliminate or at least tone that down a bit?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of in-group, out-group that comes up in life, right? And that is especially acute sometimes for young people. But at the same time, I would look at any adult and tell them that kids are better at this than we are. They're often more curious, and they also exist in a bigger world than we do, right? Their world, just by nature, since they have been alive, has been bigger than our world was, and then generations, before us. And so, literally, they have their own language, right? They have vocabulary words that we have no idea what they mean, right? And we're like, okay,
That's
you
true.
just go off and say, we don't know, right?
Yeah.
But, and I think when you bring young people together into a space, curiosity is going to get the better of them. And they often, whether it's music or movies or comics or, whatever it is, right? Books, they pretty quickly have something to talk about, right? And that naturally then leads to talking about the harder stuff, the different stuff, right? And so they get to discover along the way these things they have in common, and also these things that make them uniquely who they are. And as young people, develop the ability to articulate their identity, to articulate their beliefs, that ability to see something bigger than just their own bubble helps them all the more feel ownership of who it is that they are in the world. And so there's a lot of value in being able to do that. And I think, and the other piece that you will always hear me talk about when I talk about youth work is that it can't just happen in a bubble, right? It has to happen intergenerationally. It has to happen, in the broader context of the world, or you wind up with groups of youth who become very insular to themselves. They become their own in-group, right, of an age bracket.
Cliques.
And they feel like we're inheriting this world, right, here in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, right, that we never got to say anything about, right? And we know, right, we don't like all the things that we inherited, right? This happens generation by generation. And how is it that we can sort of poke holes at that a little bit and say that all voices of all ages, young people included, belong at the table and belong in the conversation to talk about what the world, can, should, and could be.
So are you getting inquiries? What sort of response are you getting?
So many.
Yeah, a lot. We have about 115 downloads of the toolkit so far. And we've got a bunch happening in Skagit County already. I was talking to some folk back in Louisville just the other day, and there's like 3 of them planned back there. We're planning one in San Antonio here soon with another interfaith group to sort of show leaders what this is like. Hannah's working on some of that. We're even seeing some cities begin to take this on and say, hey, we want to encourage all of our wisdom communities and nonprofits and other organizations and groups of people to just come together. So we're kind of seeing a bit of a movement on this right now, and we really are in great debt to Seattle University's Center for Engagement because they have been really doing a great job expanding the network nationally. And so we're in a lot of conversations with different organizations across the country that are worried about some of these dynamics and are doing some of this bridge building work.
There's one thing I would like to add about the toolkit as a practitioner. One of the things I really appreciate about it is that it's honest upfront to say, this might feel awkward, it might be messy, you might get something wrong, and all of that is okay. Don't let the fear of, I don't want to say the wrong thing, keep you from entering into a space of engagement with folks and nurturing relationships. Because if we all just sit in that place of, I'm well-intentioned, but I don't want to do it wrong, so I guess I won't do it, then we're all losing out. And so just muster your courage and take that first step, knowing that it might not go exactly the way you want it to, but it'll be a learning experience nonetheless, and we'll all be better for that.
And what we've seen in the kind of work we do, similar to the potluck, is that folk come in with that anxiety because they're seeing this 30%, they're seeing all this polarization, they're hearing all negative news about each other and other groups. And so there is anxiety that you carry into the door with you. But then what happens on the other side is really kind of miraculous, is that folk walk out saying, I feel hopeful. But they also walk out with kind of a question like, why weren't we thinking of this before? Because what is more primally human to do intergroup work and kind of work through issues than to sit down for dinner? Like that's been happening for human beings since we existed. And so folk are kind of like both relieved and hopeful and energized, but they're also like, where did we lose this? And I think that America has gone so far down the path of individualism. We've forgotten how to be individuals, be who we are, but be who we are together with folk who are also themselves. And what more primal, deep kind of human way than just to sit down with a meal and some conversation with people. And I think what folk will walk out of there with is a lot of energy and also this sense of relief, that there is hope for us as a society, that we don't have to keep living this way.
Understanding, relief, and connection. I think those are really good foundational values that you're doing with this program. I thank each of you and wish you nothing but the best in this program as you move forward. So thank you so much for joining us, and we thank you for joining us for this edition of Challenge 2.0. Hope you join us again next week.